What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s. They took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden box often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butterbox babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. The New London School Explosion. On the afternoon of March 18, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, TX, turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car park 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this couldn't ever happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family, so I didn't really know too much about it other than the fact that he'd survived until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated. So my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his, actually very interesting, life, including a big section on the New London School Explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. Papa was in 8th grade when it happened. In his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom, as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row, and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time, and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies and parts of bodies everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive, but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boy started lowering the injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath, most of it absolutely horrific. But I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in, so that there was some sense of normalcy when school started again in the fall. Papa had played French horn in the school band. However, when school started up again, he was asked to switch to trumpet, as the entire trumpet section had been killed. A few years later, my grandfather went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflict in the Pacific, including Peleliu and the liberation of Manila. But he said that nothing he saw during the war was ever as bad as what he saw the day of the explosion. I'm always amazed that more people don't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Edit. Holy cow. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of interest this has brought. Thank you for all of the awards and comments. To address the couple of things people mentioned in the comments, there is a small museum at the site of the explosion in New London. If you're ever out that way, I do recommend checking it out. It is very well done and incredibly moving. My grandfather's story, while amazing, is just one of many that day. A couple people mentioned the telegram from Hitler. Yes, it's there at the museum. This was a few years before he came into full power, but he was an up-and-coming political figure in Germany at the time. I looked it up online. The original is in German, but the translation reads, "On the occasion of the terrible explosion at New London, Tex, which took so many young lives, I want to assure your excellency of my and the German people sincere sympathy. Adolf Hitler, German Reichschancellor." I don't know the details, but I do know from some things my grandmother said that Papa had some PTSD, both from the explosion and the war. We did get the recordings converted to digital files, which we had stored in several safe locations. A number of years ago I undertook the project of transcribing everything and putting together a book of my grandfather's total memoirs. In addition to the school explosion, he really lived a fascinating life. As a little kid, he was present for one of the most famous circus disasters of all time, the Corsicana Red Elephant Rampage, and he saw some of the fiercest action in the Pacific as an engineer for the Army Air Force during WW2. He also went from being the dirt poor son of an oil field worker to a pretty successful salesman. Later in life, at the same time my dad went to graduate school, Papa decided to go back to school and get his master's as well, which led to a career shift to become a college professor, and he taught in both Louisiana and Hong Kong. He was really a very interesting guy. Sadly, he had his two strokes when I was pretty young, and he died when I was 14. So all of my memories of him are of a pretty ill man in a wheelchair, working on transcribing his memoirs. I feel like I got to know him better after his death than I ever did in life. I'm so thankful for that. I compiled the memoirs into a book that we published just for family members. In addition to my grandfather's personal photographs, he kept a camera with him all throughout the war. There are a number of pictures that I pulled from online, so we couldn't publish it as it is due to copyright issues. But maybe someday I will go back and reformat everything to submit to the Library of Congress or for wider distribution. You want a happy story about him to help counter the explosion? This is a good one. At the start of WW2, while he was in basic training, a girl named Kitty sent her brother Keith a goofy picture of herself splashing around in the creek behind their family farm in TX. The picture of Kitty caught the attention of Keith's bunkmate, Papa, who decided to write Kitty a smart alecky note of his own, jokingly criticizing her manners for showing her ugly bare feet in public. Kitty was not amused. She wrote him a scathing letter and received a very apologetic note from Papa in response. This began a written correspondence that continued throughout the war. Papa wrote faithfully from some of the most remote, dangerous locations in the Pacific. She sent him news of the home front and taunted him with descriptions of fried chicken dinners. He sent her pictures of crocodiles and told her of the orphan children he cared for after the liberation of Manila. When Papa came back to the US in 1946, He made a trip out to the farm to see his old friend Keith and to finally meet Kitty face to face. That was on a Friday. They were engaged the following Wednesday and were happily married for over 50 years. Edited again for a typo. Close bracket. Having to carry a memory of a girl that died in my place because I was clowning around would fuck me up for life. No wonder he didn't talk about it. Sadly, but understandably, the girl's parents apparently very much saw her death as my grandfather's fault. That's a lot of weight for a 13-year-old kid to carry, but there are a lot of stories like that. There's a little museum at the site now, and I remember reading another account of a boy who traded seats with his friend so that he could sit next to a girl he liked. When the explosion happened, his friend was killed. The whole thing just devastated a generation of children. The Halifax Explosion. Regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbour. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbour, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic's sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor heading for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last mission. Goodbye, boys. / Vincent Coleman. Train dispatcher. His last words. His sacrifice stopped a train carrying around 100 people from approaching Halifax, and is sending the message to as many stations as possible, hoping one of them would relay it in time. Spread the word of the disaster before it even happened, meaning emergency forces mobilized sooner than they would have otherwise. On a more heartwarming note, one of the cities that rushed to Halifax's aid was Boston. Halifax has always had a big Christmas tree market, and ever since then, every year, they send a special one to Boston as thanks, and every year, Boston makes it the city's official tree. I live in Boston, and the Christmas tree tradition is the reason I've heard about the Halifax explosion before. I thought I heard that people in Boston could hear the explosion, but I haven't found anything to back that up, so I might be mistaken. In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. To be specific, it was the corpse of Velma McCurdy, the "You'll Never Take Me Alive" guy. In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snake bite. Just a snake bite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections, but apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed. The most horrific part is that your family watches this death. Letting the man spend his remaining time with his family here really means making him die a slow, agonizing death in front of his family. Man, that makes it a whole lot worse actually. Yeah, I was like, well, this one isn't that bad. And then this. The sad case of Otabenga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then WWI happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. Not only was he in a freak show, but he was also put in the zoo, sharing an enclosure with apes. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s, they worked at a watch company painting the hours on the watches using radium, a radioactive element that glows in the dark. They did this with no PPE and weren't told radium is dangerous. Meanwhile, the chemists had full PPE and worked in a sealed environment. Worse, they were instructed to lick the tip of the brush to make a very fine point. Some of them would paint their nails or their teeth with it for fun. When they went out at night, they would develop cancer whenever the paint touched, and many of them had such decay in their jaws that their mandibles had to be held on with bandages. Edit. Apparently there's a new movie about this, as many redditors have helpfully pointed out. It's still an ongoing problem in the area too. I used to do radon testing for home inspections there, and it's not a safe place to live. Worst I saw was a condo on the edge of a golf course. They donated the radioactive leftover fill to make parks. It tested at about a 13.2, and the legal limit was 0.6. Okay, so, radiation safety rant. The problem with all of the atrocities that have occurred with radiation is, everyone made radiation limits based on whatever data we could get in the 60s, and now everyone is too scared to update them. The fact is, the legal limits for radiation are much more stringent than those for airlines, and that is for occupational exposure. Radon in particular has an entire industry devoted to sharing the crap out of people and manipulating real estate values over meaningless levels of radon. Quick lesson about radon/radium, alpha emitters such as these have no effect as long as they are contained/solid. The parties themselves are stopped by the layer of dead skin on your arm, unlike X-ray/gamma radiation, which goes through you. Great. NBD right. Wrong. Radon is a gas, so you inhale it. This means those alpha particles are released in your lungs, where there is no layer to protect you from the damage. Oof. This is where the licking part in the radium dial story becomes so horrific. As far as I'm aware, there is no dead layer to protect your gum tissue. In addition to this, that radium likely stayed in their mouths, effectively causing contamination hazards all day. The basics of radiation safety are time, distance, shielding. With a contamination hazard, the material is physically on your body and causing the most damage physically possible until a poo wash it off. It's basically like carrying a tiny irradiator around in a bracelet. Would you stand in front of an X-ray machine all day? No. So you should wash contaminants off with cold water as soon as possible. The longer you are around radiation, the more dose/damage it does. Now shielding. There is none. Dead layer of skin is skipped as soon as the contaminant enters your mouth, which is why you are not allowed to eat in labs with the possibility of loose radioactive material. Big oof. Testing for radon is great, and minimization is ideal. It is, however, taken to an extreme rather frequently. Radon at a public park, for instance. Probably NBD. Why? Time. Shielding/mitigation. A. You don't spend more than a couple hours a week at the park. Those 2 hours are probably a lot less harmful than that day you spent at the beach without layers of sun protecting clothing. B. The park is in open air. The radon seeps from the soil. Chances are the breeze will mitigate most of the issue on a normal day. So just don't spend the entire time snorkeling in the garden dirt, and you will be fine. Now basements are what get your average homie awana. But again, time, distance, shielding. A. How much time do you spend in your basement? As long as no one has a bedroom there, there is no real concern for someone being there long enough for it to be even remotely an issue. B. Mitigation. This is where older homes have issues. Any cracks or gaps in the foundation let radon in, and the repair is insanely expensive because a new foundation is essentially built over a small gap that allows the gases that would normally seep into your basement to be pressurized and pulled into a chimney that releases it into the open air. Super expensive, and a good chunk of the time could be sufficiently solved with fans and some open windows if you are crafty. Also, winter is the worst time of year to test for radon due to the natural lack of fresh air in the house. Make sure that, if you are putting it on a record that affects the value of your home, that you chose the season that gives the lowest radon reading for your area. Radon levels also depend on frozen soil, rain, etc. Don't toast yourself by letting a radon specialist scare you into a mitigation system, because it is one half of the uber conservative regulation limit in January. You will be wasting a lot of money for very Very little overall risk reduction. Cheers. Your friendly neighborhood nuclear engineer and rad safety specialist, edited for Typus BC. I was too lazy to put my glasses on. Somebody is up to date on their Alera training. I actually have some serious questions about radium exposure at my work after reading this. I'll get some specifics and follow up when I get into the office tomorrow morning. Happy to help. If you are new to TattleTale TV, please subscribe. We have new videos every day. Stay tuned for more coming up next.